Much. Thanks for joining us this morning. A very obscure group, but very important group, I think, in terms of the ecology of our rivers and lakes, our aquatic systems. So what I'm going to do today, it's probably quite a diverse audience that we have, from specialists to sort of amateur, sort of aquatics, people with an interest in aquatic environments. So I'm going to just give you a kind of background about the group, the aquatic mayflies, and then give you a little bit of detail about the national survey that we're doing of the mayflies. And it's really important that we're doing this at this point because we're due to do our red listing, and I'll explain that a little bit later, but that's basically establishing their conservation status in Ireland. Very timely because our water quality, as many might know, is actually decreasing, and we're very worried about that and the impact on many aquatic invertebrates and mayflies included. So this is a project that we sort of pitched to, as Eleanor said, it's funded through the National Biodiversity Action Fund, and 28 councils are involved. Actually, another council themselves are funding it. So, and LawPro is also funding this project. So we pitched this project to try and get a national coverage over the next 2 years. So it's a 2-year project that's running this year and next year. It's in collaboration with many people. I'm leading it, but there are many collaborators like Hugh Feely and Mary Kelly Quinn are intricately involved, and there's lots of people that we're dependent on to get records to collect specimens and also give us records from past research projects and things like that. So I suppose just a quick one. Mayflies belong to an order of insects. There are many different orders of insects. The mayflies all belong to the order Ephemeroptera. Now, this is actually an incredibly primitive group. It's one of the first groups that evolved that have very clear characteristics of ancient kind of taxa within the insects. They kind of developed about 3 million years ago. There's more than 3,000 species worldwide. They're in aquatic systems, so they're all aquatic. So the larvae are aquatic and the adults tend to be terrestrial. And as a result of the decrease in water quality, about 20% are threatened. And we need to establish where we are with the mayflies in Ireland. So in terms of the order of insects, it's Ephemeroptera. And the meaning of that is that ephemeris, which is short-lived, and we're all kind of aware that mayflies, I think back of a advert about mayflies, that it just, they're there for a day or two and then they're gone. Now that's just the adult, of course. So they're known as sort of short-lived insects, but actually some of them take a couple of years. Some of them take a couple of years to develop. The other part of that name, Ephemeroptera, is that they're winged, and that's really important because they've able to exploit different habitats. So as larvae, they exploit the aquatic environment, and as adults, they exploit the terrestrial environment. So what we would typically, I think most people would associate with, is the adult form of mayflies. And here we have a picture of an insect, and actually this weird kind of, you can see the eyes almost on stalks. This is actually a male adult. So this is what we call an imago. So the mayflies are really weird because they go through 2 stages as an adult. And I've got a video here that was sent in from Connor Arnold. I bumped into him while we were surveying the Blackwater River, and he said, "Oh, look at this," and he had taken a video of this. You'd be forgiven to think this is all just kind of mist, but these are adult canid mayflies. So this is Canis rivulorum and luctuosa, which are the 2 species, but you can see the whole, there's millions of them actually appearing there. And it kind of just gives you an indication that actually mayflies are incredibly abundant in aquatic systems, but they're also abundant in terrestrial systems. And I think that that's an important thing that we should all be aware of, that, although we look after the aquatic systems to try and support mayflies, they are incredibly important in terrestrial systems too. So if I give you, I've just taken an example of a very well illustrated example here of the life cycle of a mayfly. And this is important if we're thinking about conserving our species, because, like I said, the mayflies are dependent on aquatic systems as well as terrestrial systems as the adult. So the riparian habitat next to rivers are equally as important. So here we have a very typical life cycle: adult laying eggs into the water, a nymph developing in the water, coming out, and it's a really weird group. They actually go through 2 adult life stages. So it comes out, emerges. They're incredibly vulnerable at that stage, as many anglers would know. That's the stage when often mayflies are picked off the surface of the water. It's at that stage then that they try and dry off, and then they molt into a second adult form. And if I can just show you this is what we call a subimago. So this is an adult that's just come out of the water. And what you'll notice here is that actually it has 2 cerci, these little sort of tails at the end. And you see the wing is it's not that see-through. And that's a telling sign. And there's actually a fringe of hairs along the edge of the wing. So if you have a look here on the edge of the wing, you can see a fringe of hairs. And then you know that's the first stage of the adult. They then morph into the imago stage, and it's at that stage that the genitalia are all kind of solidified. The size of the legs are appropriate to try and latch onto individuals during mating. So they're very unique. It's the only insect order that has 2 adult stages. So in terms of the life cycle, then just to complete that, the mayflies lay their eggs into aquatic systems. Now, it's incredible when you actually look at that process. I have a video here. This is a mayfly that's come out. So it's gone through those 2 stages, gone and mated, and now has come into the water, climbed into the water, go under the rock, and it's laying its eggs on the rock here. So this is a species that goes in and places the eggs. Many of them distribute them just on the surface of the water, and the eggs actually then just kind of settle into different substrates and things, and then they have to persist. Now, some species even have really intricate sort of systems to try and maintain them in the water. So of course, rivers are flowing. So this Ectoneurus egg on the left-hand side, you'll see a scanning electron micrograph of that. And you can see that they've got these little terminated coiled threads, and they shoot out to attach themselves onto a surface and hold themselves into the water. So they've developed really weird sort of systems, and they are species specific. So this is Ectoneurus insignis. If I show you an Ectoneurus venosus, which we also have in Ireland, it's completely different. And what you'll also notice is these weird little structures here. These are actually guide the sperm into the egg to actually fertilize the egg. Not all eggs have to be actually fertilized for mayflies. Some species are actually parthenogenic. So when we talk about mayflies, I think most people, it's probably fair to say in Ireland, this is the iconic species. In May, this thing merges. These are the larvae on the left-hand side, the adult on the right, in the middle. And this is what struck me is when I speak to people about mayflies, they often just are thinking about the species. And of course, we have many other different species. But because it's so iconic and it's so important for fishing in particular, because the fish really go, they really become quite active during the period when mayflies emerge. And we're really concerned about this species because when you talk to fishermen, they often say that, we haven't seen a hatch really well for a long time. What's happening to the hatch? These are the questions they're asking. But interestingly enough, this is a map of the species records from the National Biodiversity Data Centre, which is the database we're using to try and assess the status of mayflies in Ireland. And then we're contributing to that with new records. But here you can see that ephemerodonic is actually one that's well recorded in the last sort of 10 years, completely different to any of the other species. And it just reinforces the idea that when we talk about mayflies, this is what we're thinking about. In actual fact, there's lots of different species. So here we've got just a small sort of example of the different families within the mayflies. You'll notice that as larvae, they've all got 3 cerci. So these are these little structures at the back of the abdomen, and that's a really good characteristic in Ireland to tell them apart from stoneflies and other aquatic invertebrates. But you'll also notice that they've all got gills. In fact, they reckon that gills were actually the first thing to develop, so they can actually extract oxygen from the water using these gills. But it was also important, the first set of gills on the thorax, which is that part that holds the legs, is actually would have developed the wings in adults. So here we've got a diversity of the different species, and it just shows you that it's not only just Ephemerodontia that we're concerned about. In fact, we've got 33 different species in Ireland, and we've got quite a number within each of these families. So Heptagenids, we have I think over 7. Batids, we have many different batid species. Canids, we have different canid species that are either common or very rare. And leptophlebids, here you can see these feathery gills at the bottom here. Just to give you an idea, all of these species are actually very highly adapted to where they live in the river. So yes, they live in the water and aquatic environment, but some species like particular microhabitats within the environment. So here I'll just show you just a video that we've taken in a river, small little headwater stream, and you can see the actual rock here. And as I turn it over here, you'll see multiple heptagenids sticking onto the rock here. So you can see them all attached, and they are actually morphologically adapted to resist the high flow. So here their legs are actually flattened, the whole insect is flattened, and so they're actually, the water that flows over their femurs, which is part of their legs, pushes them onto the rock and maintains them in position. So these species like fast flowing water, but at times when they're about to emerge as the subimago to become the adult, they sometimes go to the edge of the river. So they change their microhabitat use. So why are mayflies important? You know, I love them. I'm an entomologist and aquatic ecologist, so of course I'm going to love them. But mayflies are incredibly important. They have direct and indirect services to humans that we might not just be that aware. I suppose if you're from the angling community, it's really important for fishing. Mayflies have inspired writers, poets, musicians. There's festivals of mayflies, fishing competitions, internationally recognized areas that are really important for fishing. Things like Loch Corrib are internationally renowned for fishing for brown trout in that lake. But mayflies are also important from an ecological perspective. So they are placed within the food web. So they're amongst lots of other different macroinvertebrates. So these are sort of larger invertebrates that live in the water. And here, if I can just highlight it here, they have a particular function. Most mayflies actually graze the algae and the periphyton. So it's that slimy layer on rocks and things like that. And here you can see on the right-hand side, this is actually a mouth part of one of the species. And they've got all kinds of hairs and little hooks and things like that they use to scrape the algae off the rocks. Now, they are important in regulating periphyton and biofilm on these rocks and also on plant material. That stuff grows on plant material as well. But they're an important component for doing that within the ecosystem. But also they are obviously food for other things, other predators, other insects, other fish. Like we use them to mimic what fish feed on. When we look at the gut content of brown trout, they're a big component of that at particular times when they're active. They're important in the aquatic system because they're part of that ecosystem, but they're integral in terms of how that system works. So they are important in supporting the services that the ecosystem provides. So bioturbation, which is kind of movement of sediment, if you like, through organisms and then deposited back in. Decomposition, so they feed on the organic material. And then they're nutrition for many kinds of animals. So they're food for other things. So they're very important in terms of the energy that comes into an aquatic system, excuse me, and that goes through those different trophic levels. That's within the aquatic system, but also in the terrestrial system, because if you just take a few minutes and watch birds along a river, you'll see that say grey wagtail or something like that, or a dipper, they're very tuned into when mayflies hatch, and the swallows pick them off on wing, and you could see them sitting there feeding on lots of different adults coming off of mayflies. So they're really important in that system, and they actually feed a lot of the spider webs and things like that, spiders in terrestrial systems too. So they're important in regulating that energy flow in aquatic systems and also terrestrial systems. They also help us to indicate what water quality is like. So they serve as bioindicators of the ecosystem health. So our national method of assessing water quality is by looking at the chemical properties, but also the macroinvertebrates. So they use the macroinvertebrates to tell us what ecological status is that water body is in. And here I've made an illustration here of the macroinvertebrates present in rivers, and you can see a vast community present on the left-hand side. Typically, we have things that are sensitive to pollution, things that are not sensitive to pollution in a normal community. But as soon as we start putting pressures on the system, be it eutrophication, sedimentation, introduction of pesticides, etc., change in habitat destruction, these species tend to be sensitive to that. And so once that has happened, we lose some components. And typically, if you look on the right-hand side here, when we talk about waters that are good, these are kind of at what we would like to be the minimum requirement. So the good water quality, we sustain a fairly good sort of complex of mayfly. But as soon as that drops to moderate or poor, so this deterioration to the water, we're losing mayflies for sure. And by poor status, the rivers are really in a state where many of our mayflies wouldn't be occurring. And we're worried about this slow deterioration or the rapid deterioration in our water quality. So we're worried about how that's going to impact our mayflies. So just to give you a little bit of background, in Ireland, we have 33 documented species. So this is the list of species here. You're not supposed to, you're not supposed to see them all there, but essentially, this is the list of species that was assessed for their conservation status in 2012. And subsequent to that, things have changed. We've established that there's a different species, Baetis atlanticus in Ireland. We also question whether we've got Canis pseudoruveolorum, so that's a different canis species. We're not quite sure if we've got Siphloneurus aestivalis, which was detected in the UK. So we're really keen to figure out, these new developments, whether they've actually affected our species list. The red listing also indicated, really importantly, is that there are a number of species that have red listing status. So they're critically rare. They are endangered species, 2 species. There's 3 species that are vulnerable, and there are 2 species that are near threatened. And there's quite a few that we have very little data for. So it's really important that we have projects like this. So we dedicate our surveys, and then we can collect records and use those records to establish their conservation status a bit better. So what are the things that are most likely to affect mayflies? As I said, the decrease in water quality. We've seen our water quality decreasing in lakes and rivers, and for multiple reasons, but it's a really complex issue. We've probably heard about things like nitrates. So these are nutrients coming into the water, and our levels of nitrates are just not where they should be. So we're getting too much nutrients in areas where there shouldn't be nutrients coming into the water, and this is affecting the entire ecosystem. And so if they're part of that ecosystem, they're going to respond to those changes. How they respond exactly is difficult, is actually quite complex, because the nutrients don't directly affect them, but indirectly affect them. And there's so many sort of environmental context that really affects that how it affects the rest of the habitat and the ecosystem. So things like sedimentation, this is the introduction of fine sediments, is also really quite a key stressor that we're worried about. Peat extraction, and this is kind of more past experience of peat extraction, excessive peat extraction affecting the Shannon system, for example, for years. The introduction of that organic matter is going to affect how all the other invertebrates respond to that. Habitat destruction is important. Pesticides, we tend not to have a good handle on how pesticides are affecting our aquatic invertebrates. So we're really quite concerned about them. And then invasive species. So in terms of water quality, I think I'll show you this. It's fairly complex kind of graphic, but it does show something really important. And that's, so if you look at this graph on the top left-hand side here, you see high quality, good quality, and then we've got moderate and poor quality water. And what you can see there is that the proportion of high quality and good quality is actually decreased. So we're getting more and more rivers that are not meeting good ecological status in Ireland. So when the EPA do their national survey, they're finding more systems impacted. And so when you think back to that graphic that I showed you, where if we get moderate and poor water quality, we're going to lose our mayfly species. The other stressor that we're kind of, actually, a lot of my work, my research is in invasive species, and we have very little handle on how a lot of our invasive species are impacting our native species, and that includes mayflies. So the introduction of, say, Gammarus pulex, this is a shrimp, aquatic shrimp. They now have outcompeted our native shrimps in some systems, and they feed generally, so they feed on eggs of stuff, so they'll feed on eggs of insects, larvae of insects and things like that. So they feed on mayflies for sure. The other species here is a aquatic snail, and that also competes with mayflies because they also feed, they graze on the periphyton and biofilm, as I explained to you about mayflies. So they're going to be in direct competition, and they occur in high numbers. So in terms of the project then, the red listing in Ireland was done in 2012. Just to sort of say that we used about I think at the time, 14,000 records were used. In the National Biodiversity Data Centre, we've got 6,957 records. This was at the start of the year. At that point, because the red listing is basically establishing the conservation status of a species, and to do that, you need to have data of their distribution. And we're assessing the past distribution, their current distribution, and assessing whether that's changed significantly. And so recent records of where things occur are important. So what we found before we started the project is that there's only really a small number of site records or species records added to the national database of mayflies. And so that is a problem, because then we just can't do the red listing, because we can't assess how the distribution has changed for a species. So we recognize that we have to go out and take these samples and look for these species, but also that we looked at other data sets available. So just to illustrate where we were before we started the project, this is a species, Beta scambus. I would say this is a very common species. And if you look on the right-hand side, you can see a graphic here. There's a map taken from the National Biodiversity Data Centre data, and it shows a complete, it occurs pretty much everywhere in Ireland. There are particular places that they don't occur in, but that's probably got to do with the local conditions in terms of the water, what the characteristics of that water is like. In the last sort of 10 to 12 years, we don't have very many records of this very common species. So it just shows you that we have very little data available for us to do the red listing. And this is why this project was put into place. Here we've got Rithregina germanica. This is a really weird species. It looks like a very common species we have. This is Rithregina semicolorata. This is an insect that sits on the rocks in fast-flowing water. In fact, its gills are so well adapted to form a suction cup onto the rock. So the species here, Germanica, is a much larger species, and I've got an example here of just about when they're emerging, both species, and you can see that Germanica is much bigger. There are other little characteristics to look out for to be able to identify the species. But if we look at, again, the records that we have very few records in Ireland in the database, in the National Biodiversity Database. And so we want to improve that. In the last 10 years, we only had one record, so we can't establish their conservation status. So the project aimed to do early samples in summer, have a very systematic approach in terms of how we survey different types of rivers and things like that, and lakes, so that we get all the species. We want to also develop photographic guides, so we want a sort of a illustration how to identify larvae as well as the adults, and I'll show you an example of that. And then, of course, we recognize we're not going to get to all these sites. It's important that people on the ground are actually at the right time collecting material. So we're trying to engage with anglers in particular, anybody who's interested, in fact, to collect material and send back the material to us for identification. So we don't expect everybody to kind of know the intricacies of identifying a particular species. If you want to take a shot at it, great, we can help you there, but to send us material. So we're sending anglers packages with tubes. I'll call you, if you're in the audience and you might have had these, and you're collecting invertebrates and sending them. So either at the adult form or the larvae form. And then we hope at 2025, at the end of next year, to do the actual red listing, so establish the conservation status. So this is where we're at. So this is 210 sites that we've sampled so far ourselves. We've gone to really good ecological quality sites, and we've had a range depending on the system. So lakes tend to hold fewer species, and we've had about 1 to 16 different species within a site. So some sites are incredibly diverse in terms of their mayflies. So coming back to the point that most people think about Ephemera danica as the mayfly, but in actual fact, we've got loads of other species that are also important within that group. It's almost as if, sorry, just to go back to that slide, as if we were sampling bridges, because everywhere we had to quick access to try and take samples. These are the EPA sites. We're also seeing all the bridges. So these are the sites here. So this is currently at this moment where we've taken samples. It's a national project. It's difficult for us to get to all these sites. It does require concerted effort to collect stuff, in particular microhabitats. As I said, they occur in different microhabitats. And it's when we do that, when we collect lots of different species. We have now more than 1,200 records. So we're almost like a fifth of what we already have in the database in the National Biodiversity Data Center. So a targeted project like this has helped us really to record lots. We're hoping that people engage with the collection kits from the angling clubs, and that adults and larvae are collected. Larvae might be difficult because you might need equipment for that. But to collect anything really, any record will be an added bonus for the project. So what have we found? We found some really interesting stuff already, and it's only a few months in. Interestingly, I've been studying the Liffey for a long time. We knew of 15 different species on the Liffey, and then we had an outreach project with a school, and the school managed to discover a new species that we didn't know from there. It had been recorded on the Liffey 70 years ago and not since. So it just shows you that we need to try and increase our recording of these things. Only 25 records in the National Biodiversity Data Center data set. So it's really significant. So we made a little, gave her a little prize and that sort of thing. So she was delighted. So hopefully she'll have an interest in mayflies from now on. But you can see it's actually quite a widely distributed species, as the records are starting to show. with this dedicated surveys. Coming back to that Erythrogena germanica, we've actually increased the records already of germanica. And in fact, this is a species that has benefited from really bad weather this year. If there's one thing that came out of it, is that Erythrogena germanica was detected quite late, right up into June, which is quite remarkable. It's supposed to disappear by April. So it's a really early emerger, but because of the poor weather we've had, they were delayed by a month and a half. So really interesting, actually. Another interesting species or complex of species is Baetis rhodani. Up to recently, up until this publication by Hugh Feely et al. And Craig McAdam, they detected that actually Atlanticus was present in Ireland. Here, actually, from the samples we've now taken, you can actually see where, so Baetis atlanticus and Baetis rhodani were very hard to tell apart. And so you could only use the male paraproct, and you can see the different sort of spines and things like that. So this project has allowed us to disentangle the status of these two species. And you can see, because of the early part of the year, I think Atlanticus is dominating, and we're thinking that maybe rhodani will dominate later on, although this is not always the case, because sometimes you have both species present, and sometimes you have Baetis rhodani only present, but earlier. So really interesting things happening there. So as part of the output, we wanted to make an identification guide. This is an example of what we're going to produce. So essentially on the left-hand side, this is similar to what we're hoping to do, is similar to what Salisbury District Anglers have done. Really nice key showing each species, how to identify the key features, both of the larvae and adult. And here you can actually see an image that we've now generated through the help of Connor Williams, is a local photographer, and he's processing the photographs we give him. And you can see that we can now use that, and we can use that for promotional stuff and guides and things like that. So that's one of the outputs. So that's really all for me, other than just acknowledge that this can't happen without any funding. So LawPro, local authorities water program, has really come in and supported us financially, and also by their staff helping collections. Department of Housing, Local Government Heritage, so part of the National Biodiversity Action Fund. This is a project that's been funded through that, and also the council has to contribute to that. So the funding is coming from the council as well. So the Biodiversity Officer Network has been brilliant and have arranged this as well, which is excellent for us to promote this and hopefully get this information out to people. Angling clubs are so important. We hope to engage more and more with angling clubs as the project goes on, and that we can give feedback as to what is being sent to us, and then give you local information about the species. And then EPA have got lots of data, so we're hoping we're going to gather some of that data and verify that data. So that's really all for me. Thanks for listening, guys.